finance minister has said that he believes the threat of retaliation against U.S. trade measures will persuade President to back away from steel and aluminum tariffs, as the other G7 finance ministers delivered harsh words about the U.S. policy and vowed reprisal. Canadian Finance Minister Bill Morneau spoke on Friday at a meeting of finance ministers from the G7 in Whistler, British Columbia, saying the threat of retaliatory measures could work against Trump. "We see that response as being a way to get us back to the table so the impacts actually don't happen," Morneau said. Morneau was hosting finance ministers and central bankers from the G7 group of rich nations at the mountain resort town ahead of the main summit next week, but fears of a trade war dominated the event. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has announced of $12.8 billion on a wide variety of U.S. imports including metal, toilet paper, pizzas and ball-point pens. Canada's retaliatory tariffs don't go into effect until July, which in theory leaves plenty of time for Trump to reconsider his position. Trudeau on Thursday made an emotional appeal, citing Canada's war dead who fought alongside America in World War II and Afghanistan, while taking a swipe at Trump. "Americans remain our partners, friends, and allies," Trudeau said. "This is not about the American people. We have to believe that at some point their common sense will prevail. But we see no sign of that in this action today by the U.S. administration." Canada is America's largest source of imported steel, accounting for about 17% of U.S. steel imports by volume. However, some critics accuse Canada of buying cheap Chinese steel and flipping it in the U.S. for a profit, using NAFTA as a backdoor for China to avoid U.S. anti-dumping regulations. Trump announced on Thursday that exemptions from 25% tariffs on steel and 10% tariffs on aluminum imported from Canada, Mexico and the European Union would no longer be renewed after Friday, sparking talk of a trade war. Australia negotiated a side agreement with the US and will continue to be exempt from the tariffs, as will Argentina and Brazil. Trump has said the tariffs are necessary to preserve a U.S. steel and aluminum manufacturing base, asserting that maintaining some domestic capacity is in the country's vital national security interests. Canada's Morneau told reporters that in a meeting with U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, "I expressed in strong terms our opposition to these tariffs in the steel and aluminum sector, our absolute view that this is absurd that Canada could in any way be a security risk." The finance minister said Canada's government isn't ready to discuss support or potential bailout packages for Canadian business sectors affected by the tariffs. He said the focus now is to use the threat of retaliatory measures to pressure the U.S. into reconsidering its own tariffs before any negative economic impact actually materializes. The EU is also planning a tariff counter-strike and filed a request Friday for consultations with the World Trade Organization. German Finance Minister Olaf Scholz said on Friday in Whistler, "We must find a way to get out of this." That was said clearly by everyone, and I think it was even taken on board by the United States. To that extent, we have laid a foundation to come to a better outcome at some point, he added. Scholz reiterated that he viewed the U.S. tariffs as unacceptable and against the law. Bruno Le Maire, France's economy and finance minister, said a G7 trade war should be avoided. On trade, this is a G6+1, Le Maire said after stepping outside briefly from the talks in Whistler on Friday. "We have been attacked by those tariffs. We do not have any other choice but to respond. We would have preferred not to take that kind of decision." Le Maire said U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin wasn't surprised when confronted about the tariffs inside the talks. The French official expressed hope that the discussion will lay the foundation for successful talks during next week's summit of G7 national leaders in Quebec's Charlevoix region. "We think that the G7 meetings will be useful if at the end of the G7, the United States is aware of the possible negative consequences of their decision on the unity of the G7, not only the economic unity, but also the political one," Le Maire said. British Prime Minister Theresa May has said she was «deeply disappointed at the unjustified decision» to apply the tariffs.